The unforgiving sun blazed over the New Mexico territory, casting long shadows across the cracked earth where sagebrush struggled to survive. In the dusty frontier town of Esperanza Springs, whispered tales traveled faster than tumbleweeds. Stories of the warrior sisters, three imposing women who protected the sacred tribal lands beyond the mesa with fierce determination. "No orphan has ever returned from those lands," muttered old Miguel Santos as he swept the porch of his general store, his weathered hands gripping the broom handle. The morning heat was already oppressive, and beads of sweat formed on his deeply lined forehead. Those sisters, they show no mercy to trespassers. 12-year-old Thomas McKenna pressed his small, dirt-stained face against the store's dusty window, his hollow cheeks and sunken eyes telling the story of too many missed meals. His clothes, a tattered shirt and pants several sizes too large, hung from his thin frame like rags on a scarecrow. The boy had been wandering the territory for weeks after escaping the brutal conditions of the territorial orphanage in Santa Fe. "Please, Señor Santos," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible through the glass. "Just a piece of bread. I haven't eaten in 3 days." The storekeeper's expression softened for a moment, but then hardened again as he remembered his own struggles. The drought had been merciless, and every family in town was fighting for survival. "I'm sorry, boy. I can't feed every stray that wanders through town. Try the church. Father Martinez might have something." Thomas nodded weakly and stumbled away, his bare feet leaving small clouds of dust with each step. The church bell tower loomed in the distance, but he knew from experience that charity was scarce in these hard times. As he walked down the main street, avoiding the suspicious gazes of the townspeople, he overheard two cowboys talking near the saloon. "Heard another family abandon their spread up north," one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Drought's killing everything, even the McKenna farm. Heard old Samuel finally gave up after losing his wife and daughter to the fever." Thomas froze. McKenna. That had been his father's name, the man who had died in a mining accident when Thomas was only 5. Could this Samuel be family? The boy's heart raced with a desperate hope he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, 15 miles north of town, Samuel McKenna sat on the sagging porch of his once prosperous farmhouse, staring at the endless expanse of withered crops. At 52, his face was etched with the deep lines of grief and hardship. His calloused hands, which had once coaxed life from this land, now shook slightly as he held a faded photograph of his wife Emma and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. 2 years, he whispered to the empty fields. 2 years since the fever took you both, and I still can't figure out why I'm still here." The farmhouse behind him stood as a monument to broken dreams, peeling paint, a roof that leaked in 3 places, and windows that no longer closed properly. The barn leaned dangerously to one side, and the well had run dry months ago. Samuel had sold his last horse the previous week just to buy beans and coffee that would last him another month. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thomas made a desperate decision. If this Samuel McKenna was indeed family, perhaps he represented the boy's only chance at survival. Following the directions he'd overheard, Thomas began the long walk north, his feet already blistered and bleeding from days of travel. The landscape grew more desolate with each mile. Dried creek beds snaked through the terrain like the remnants of ancient rivers, and the skeletal remains of dead cattle dotted the horizon, grim reminders of the drought's toll. As darkness began to fall, Thomas could see a faint light in the distance. A small farmhouse sitting alone against the vast sky. Samuel was lighting his evening lamp when he heard a soft knock at his door. He paused, frowning. No one came to visit anymore. Most of his neighbors had already packed up and left for California or back east. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rusty from disuse. "Please, sir, my name is Thomas McKenna. I think we might be family." Samuel's hand froze on the door handle. Slowly, he opened it to reveal the thin, desperate boy standing in the yellow circle of lamplight. The child's eyes, bright blue despite his exhaustion, were unmistakably familiar. "McKenna?" Samuel repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas nodded weakly. My father was Daniel McKenna. He died in the copper mine near Silver City when I was 5. I've been in the territorial orphanage since then, but I escaped 3 weeks ago. I heard your name in town, and I hoped— Samuel's legs nearly gave out as recognition dawned. Daniel. Daniel was my younger brother. I hadn't seen him since he went chasing gold and copper dreams 20 years ago. He looked at the boy, his nephew, his brother's son, and saw Emma and Sarah's faces in the child's desperate expression. Come inside, son, Samuel said, his voice breaking. Come inside. As Thomas crossed the threshold, neither of them noticed the 3 figures on horseback watching from the ridge overlooking the farm. The warrior sisters, Ayana, she who blooms, Tyanita, young beaver, and Winona, firstborn daughter, had been tracking the boy's movements for days, ensuring he posed no threat to their people's sacred lands that bordered McKenna's property. Ayana, the eldest at 35, sat tall and proud on her painted horse, her long black hair braided with eagle feathers, and her weathered leather clothing adorned with intricate beadwork. Her dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, had seen too much suffering to trust easily. The boy has found shelter, she said quietly to her sisters, but the old man is broken like his land. They will not survive the winter. 28-year-old Tyanita, her face painted with traditional war markings, tightened her grip on her rifle. Perhaps that is not our concern, sister. Our duty is to protect our people, not to save dying white men. But Winona, the youngest at 25, felt something stir in her chest as she watched the reunion through the farmhouse window. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Sometimes the Great Spirit sends us tests of compassion disguised as burdens. Look at them, Winona whispered. They hold each other like drowning men hold driftwood. Inside the farmhouse, Samuel was already ladling his meager soup into 2 bowls, giving Thomas the larger portion despite his own gnawing hunger. As the boy ate with desperate gratitude, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since his family's death: purpose. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this work, Samuel promised, though he had no idea how 2 desperate souls could survive where one was already failing. Outside, the warrior sisters exchanged glances that spoke of difficult decisions ahead. The coming winter would test everyone's resolve, and the sacred balance between mercy and survival hung in the desert wind like a prayer waiting to be answered. As Thomas fell asleep on Samuel's couch, the first safe place he'd known in years, none of them could imagine how their fates were about to become intertwined in ways that would challenge everything they believed about survival, family, and the courage it takes to trust strangers with your heart. The legend of the warrior sisters was about to meet its greatest test, and the desert was about to witness whether compassion could bloom in even the harshest soil. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas arrived at Samuel's farm, and while the boy had gained some weight and color in his cheeks, the harsh reality of their situation grew more apparent each day. Samuel had shared his dwindling supplies without hesitation, but now their combined survival hung by the thinnest of threads. The morning sun revealed the cruel arithmetic of their predicament: 7 cans of beans, a small bag of flour, and coffee grounds that had been used 3 times already. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, rotating a $20 gold piece between his fingers, his last valuable possession, while Thomas practiced reading from Samuel's weathered Bible. "Uncle Samuel," Thomas said, looking up from the verses about multiplication of loaves and fishes, "maybe I should go back to town. I'm eating food you need for yourself." Samuel's jaw tightened. In the boy's thin face, he saw echoes of his brother Daniel's stubbornness, but also the resigned acceptance that no child should possess. "That's not how family works, son. We figure this out together, or we don't figure it out at all." Thomas nodded, but both of them knew their noble intentions couldn't create food from empty pantries or water from dry wells. The nearest water source was now a 2-hour walk to a muddy creek that bordered the tribal lands, the same lands protected by the legendary warrior sisters. That afternoon, desperation drove them to make the dangerous journey. Samuel loaded his rifle and checked his saddlebags twice, while Thomas filled every container they owned with the hope of bringing back enough water for drinking and cooking. The trek across the sun-baked landscape was treacherous. Thomas's legs, still weak from years of poor nutrition, struggled to keep pace with Samuel's determined stride. Halfway to the creek, the boy stumbled and fell, scraping his hands on the sharp volcanic rock that littered the ground. I can't keep up," Thomas gasped, his face flushed with heat and exhaustion. Samuel knelt beside his nephew, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The boy was trying so hard to be strong, but his small body was simply pushed beyond its limits. "We rest here," Samuel decided, though he knew the delay could prove costly. As they sat in the meager shade of a juniper tree, both of them scanning the horizon for any sign of the feared guardians, Samuel made a decision that surprised himself. "Thomas, I need to tell you something about your father." Samuel's voice grew soft with memory. "Daniel wasn't just my brother. He was my best friend. When we were kids, no bigger than you are now, we used to sneak onto Navajo land to swim in their secret waterholes." Thomas's eyes widened. "Weren't you scared of getting caught?" "Terrified," Samuel admitted with a slight smile. "But Daniel, he had this way of seeing good in people, even when they had every reason to distrust us. One day, we got lost, and it was a Navajo boy about our age who led us safely home. Your father never forgot that kindness." The story seemed to give Thomas new strength, and they resumed their journey. But as they approached the creek, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the canyon walls. 3 riders emerged from behind a massive red rock formation, moving with the fluid grace of people born to this harsh landscape. The warrior sisters had been watching their approach for over an hour. Ayana rode slightly ahead of her sisters, her presence commanding even at a distance. Her horse, a magnificent Appaloosa with spots like scattered stars, stepped delicately across the rocky ground. The leather armor she wore bore the sacred symbols of her clan, and the rifle across her saddle was both a warning and a promise. Tayanita flanked to the left, her face painted with white and red clay, in patterns that spoke of warrior status. Her dark eyes assessed every detail of the 2 trespassers, their desperate body language, their meager supplies, the way the older man positioned himself protectively in front of the boy. Winona rode to the right, and despite her fearsome reputation, there was something in her expression that suggested she saw more than just intruders. Her grandmother had been a healer, and she recognized the signs of people pushed to the very edge of survival. Samuel raised his hands slowly, his rifle remaining holstered, despite every instinct screaming at him to defend his nephew. "We mean no harm," he called out, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "We're just trying to reach the creek. Our well has been dry for months." Ayana brought her horse to a stop 20 feet away, close enough to speak, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage. When she spoke, her English was precise and unaccented, though her words carried the weight of absolute authority. "This land is sacred to our people," she declared. "The water you seek to take belongs to the children and elders of our tribe. Many white men have made the same request. Most were turned away, some were not." Thomas stepped forward despite Samuel's protective gesture, and something in the boy's movement caught Winona's attention. There was no arrogance in his approach, no sense of entitlement, only the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to accept whatever fate delivered. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his young voice carrying surprising steadiness, "we are not asking to take anything that belongs to your people. If we could just fill our containers and leave some payment." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the only thing of value he possessed, a small silver compass that had belonged to his father. The gesture hit Winona like a physical blow. She had expected defiance, demands, or the usual mixture of fear and aggression that white settlers displayed when confronted. Instead, this starving boy was offering his most precious possession for the simple right to drink water. Tayanita's expression remained stern, but she exchanged a meaningful glance with Ayana. In their culture, such an offering spoke of respect and understanding, qualities rarely demonstrated by the farmers and miners who had been encroaching on their territory. Samuel watched the exchange with growing amazement. His nephew, this boy who had been failed by every adult authority in his life, somehow understood the language of honor that these women spoke. "Keep your compass, boy," Ayana said finally, though her tone had softened almost imperceptibly. "But tell me, why should we care if you and your kinsmen survive another week? Your people have taken our water, our game, our sacred places. What makes you different?" The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, and Samuel felt the weight of generations of conflict and mistrust. But Thomas, perhaps because he had been abandoned by his own people, found words that neither Samuel nor the sisters expected. "Because we're not really anybody's people right now," Thomas said simply. "My uncle lost his family to fever, and I lost mine to just being unlucky, I guess. We're just trying to figure out how to be family to each other without taking anything from anybody else's family." Winona felt tears prick her eyes, though her face remained impassive. The boy's words echoed her grandmother's teachings about the interconnectedness of all suffering, how loss in one heart created ripples that touched other hearts across all boundaries. "Dismount," Ayana commanded suddenly. "Both of you." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Thomas placed a small hand on his uncle's arm, somehow sensing that this moment required trust, not weapons. As they stood on the rocky ground, the three sisters dismounted as well, moving with the synchronized precision of people who had fought and survived together for years. Up close, Samuel could see that their legendary, fearsome reputation was well earned. These women were warriors in every sense of the word. But he could also see something else. The careful way Winona's eyes assessed Thomas's thin frame, the subtle concern in Tayanita's expression as she noted the boy's bleeding palms, and the conflict playing across Ayana's face as she struggled between duty and compassion. "The creek is 200 yards that way," Ayana said finally, pointing toward a line of cottonwood trees. "Fill your containers, but know this, next time you come to our borders, bring something of value to trade. Not silver or gold, but proof that you understand the cost of what you're asking for." Samuel started to ask what she meant, but Tayanita stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "Our grandmother used to say that water taken without understanding its value will never satisfy thirst. But water shared between those who honor its source can sustain life through any drought." As they walked toward the creek, Thomas fell into step beside Winona, who found herself unexpectedly moved by the boy's quiet courage. "Your grandmother sounds wise," Thomas said. "I wish I could have met her." Winona glanced down at the boy, seeing in his earnest face the same quality that had drawn her to the healing arts, the ability to see light even in dark places. "She would have liked you," Winona said quietly. "She always said the bravest people are those who keep hoping when they have every reason to give up." At the creek, as Samuel and Thomas filled their containers with precious water, the five of them stood in an unusual silence. Not the tension of enemies, but the careful quiet of people trying to understand if trust was possible. The sun was beginning its descent toward evening when they prepared to part ways. Samuel had expected to simply express gratitude and leave, but Ayana surprised him with a question that would change everything. "This farm of yours," she said, "how much land?" 160 acres, Samuel replied. "But most of it's worthless now. Nothing grows, no water, buildings falling down." Ayana exchanged glances with her sisters, and some unspoken communication passed between them, the kind of silent conversation that only people who had survived together could share. "Our people have knowledge of drought farming," Ayana said carefully, "techniques passed down for generations, and we have certain needs that might align with yours. Samuel frowned, not understanding, but Thomas felt a flutter of hope in his chest. What kind of needs? The boy asked. Winona stepped forward, and for the first time, her warrior's mask slipped slightly, revealing the healer underneath. Our reservation has many children who need to learn the white man's ways if they're to survive in the changing world. Reading, writing, arithmetic, but they also need to learn our ways, to honor the land, to understand the old wisdom. Tianita added, and we have skills your people need to survive here. Not just farming, but hunting, preserving food, finding water where others see only dust. The proposition took shape slowly, like a picture emerging from fog. A trade agreement that could benefit everyone, the sisters' people gaining access to education and cultural exchange, while Samuel and Thomas received the knowledge and assistance that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. You're talking about, Samuel began, hardly daring to hope. Partnership, Ayana said firmly. Not charity, not conquest. Partnership. As the sun set over the New Mexico territory that evening, 5 people who should have been enemies found themselves imagining a different kind of future. One where the harsh desert might become a place where different kinds of families could grow and flourish together. But partnerships born of desperation face their greatest tests when desperation fades, and the desert had not finished challenging their newfound resolve. The hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. The first frost of winter arrived early that year, painting the desert landscape in silver and testing every promise made beside the sacred creek. In the 6 weeks since their initial encounter, the unlikely partnership between Samuel, Thomas, and the warrior sisters had begun to take shape, though not without its challenges. Samuel's farmhouse had been transformed into something neither he nor his late wife Emma could have imagined. The main room now served as a schoolhouse 3 days a week, where Thomas taught basic English and arithmetic to 6 native children aged 8 to 14, while Winona instructed all the children, including Thomas, in traditional ecological knowledge and healing arts. The boy had proven to be a gifted teacher, perhaps because his own struggles with abandonment gave him unusual patience with students who felt caught between 2 worlds. On this particular morning, he was helping 12-year-old Nasha, Owl, sound out words from a primer, while simultaneously learning from her about the medicinal properties of desert plants. The white man's medicine fights sickness, Nasha explained in her careful English, holding up a sprig of desert sage. But grandmother's medicine makes friends with the body, so sickness doesn't want to stay. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a journal that had become a bridge between 2 ways of seeing the world. His thin frame had filled out considerably, not just from better nutrition, but from the sense of purpose that came with being needed. Outside, Samuel worked alongside Tianita to implement traditional water conservation techniques that her people had developed over centuries. They were constructing a system of terraced gardens and rain catchments that would make the most of every precious drop of moisture. Your European ancestors tried to make the desert into something it wasn't, Tianita explained, her hands expertly weaving brush into a water barrier. Our way is to work with what the desert wants to give us. Samuel paused in his digging, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold morning air. I'm beginning to understand that Emma and I made a lot of mistakes. We kept fighting the land instead of listening to it. Tianita glanced at him with something approaching approval. In the weeks of working together, she had seen Samuel transform from a broken man clinging to failed dreams into someone willing to learn new ways of being connected to the earth. The partnership hadn't been without its difficulties. There had been tense moments when cultural misunderstandings flared into conflicts, times when Samuel's ingrained assumptions about land ownership clashed with the sisters' understanding of Earth as sacred trust, or when Thomas's enthusiasm for sharing knowledge accidentally revealed information the sisters preferred to keep within their community. But each conflict had been met with honest conversation rather than withdrawal, and the relationships had grown stronger through the process of working through differences. The real test came on a bitter December morning when a delegation of white ranchers rode up to Samuel's property, led by Marcus Hendricks, a powerful cattle baron who had been pressuring homesteaders to sell their land for months. Hendricks was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and economic pressure. At 58, he had built his fortune by being ruthless in his business dealings and strategic in his friendships with territorial officials. His arrival at Samuel's farm with 6 armed men was intended to send a clear message. "McKenna!" Hendricks called out, not bothering to dismount from his expensive horse. "I hear you've been harboring savages on your property. That's a violation of territorial regulations, and it's making the other ranchers nervous." Samuel emerged from the farmhouse, with Thomas close behind. The boy's presence seemed to surprise Hendricks, who had heard rumors but hadn't expected to see a white child so obviously thriving in this unusual arrangement. "These are my neighbors, Hendricks," Samuel replied calmly, though his hand rested on the rifle he now carried everywhere. "They're helping us work the land, and I'm helping teach their children. It's called civilization." Hendricks laughed harshly. "Civilization is what happens when white men take control of the frontier and put the Indians where they belong, on reservations, under government supervision. What you're doing here is dangerous precedent." From inside the farmhouse, the children could hear the raised voices, and Thomas felt the familiar fear of adults in conflict, the same terror that had dominated his years in the orphanage. But instead of cowering, he found himself thinking of Winona's teachings about courage being the decision to act in spite of fear. "Nasha," he whispered to the girl beside him, "go quietly out the back door and find your aunts. Tell them we need help." The native girl slipped away with the silent grace her people were famous for, while Thomas remained at the window, watching his uncle face down 6 armed men with nothing but moral conviction and a single rifle. "The territorial governor is a friend of mine," Hendricks continued, his voice growing more threatening. "One word from me, and you'll be investigated for harboring fugitive Indians, corrupting white children, and violating federal regulations about unauthorized contact with tribal members." Samuel felt his resolve waver for a moment. He had no legal standing to challenge a man like Hendricks, no political connections to protect his small experiment in cross-cultural cooperation. But then he thought of Thomas, this boy who had already survived more abandonment and betrayal than any child should endure, and his backbone stiffened. "You do what you feel you have to do, Hendricks, but I won't be driven off my land by threats and intimidation." It was at that moment that the warrior sisters arrived, emerging from the desert landscape with the fluid silence of people who had been born to this terrain. Their appearance was both magnificent and terrifying. 3 women on horseback, armed and painted for conflict, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Ayana rode directly toward Hendricks, stopping close enough that her horse's breath fogged in the cold air just inches from the rancher's face. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You are on treaty land," she announced. "This farm sits on the border between white territory and our people's sacred grounds. Any threat to our educational partnership constitutes a violation of federal agreements." Hendricks tried to maintain his bluster, but the presence of the 3 sisters had clearly unnerved his men. The legends about these women weren't just tales. They were warnings based on real encounters with people who didn't surrender or retreat. "I don't recognize any treaties with rogue Indians," Hendricks snarled, but his horse stepped backward nervously, responding to its rider's fear. Tianita moved to flank Hendricks from the left, her rifle held with casual competence. "Perhaps you don't recognize treaties because you can't read them," she said with deadly politeness. "We can arrange for you to discuss federal Indian policy directly with the territorial marshal if you prefer." The mention of federal involvement hit Hendricks like cold water. His cattle operations existed in a legal gray area that depended on avoiding official scrutiny, and he couldn't afford to have federal marshals investigating his land claims and business practices. But it was Winona who delivered the decisive blow, addressing Hendricks with the quiet confidence of someone who held powerful cards. "My cousin serves as translator for the territorial governor," she said calmly. "He was just telling us about new federal policies regarding cooperation between white settlers and native peoples. Apparently, successful partnerships like ours are being held up as examples of progressive frontier development." This was a masterful bluff. There was no such federal policy, and Winona's cousin worked as a scout, not a translator. But Hendricks had no way of verifying the claim, and the sisters' confident demeanor suggested they possessed knowledge and connections he lacked. Thomas watched from the window as the confrontation reached its climax, holding his breath as the two sides faced each other in the cold morning air. But instead of violence, he witnessed something more powerful. The moment when bullies realize their intimidation tactics won't work and they must retreat to preserve their dignity. "This isn't over, McKenna," Hendricks growled, wheeling his horse around. "You're making enemies you can't afford." As the ranchers rode away, Samuel felt his knees go weak with relief and delayed fear. He had just faced down the most powerful man in the territory and somehow survived with his principles intact. Ayanna dismounted and approached Samuel, her expression serious but not unkind. "You understand what just happened here?" she asked. Samuel nodded slowly. "I understand that we're all committed to this now, whether we planned it or not." "Good," Ayanna replied, "because what comes next will require all of us to be stronger than we've ever been before." Over the following weeks, as word of the confrontation spread throughout the territory, Samuel's farm became a symbol of something larger than any of them had initially imagined. Other struggling homesteaders began arriving, seeking advice on drought farming techniques. Native families from neighboring tribes sent representatives to observe the educational experiment. Even a few progressive territorial officials made quiet visits to assess whether this model of cooperation could be replicated elsewhere. Thomas thrived in this environment of growth and change. His natural intelligence, sharpened by years of survival, made him an effective bridge between cultures. He translated not just languages, but ways of thinking, helping people understand each other across divides that had seemed insurmountable. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently on the transformed farmstead, Samuel sat by his fireplace with Thomas, watching Winona teach a mixed group of children traditional stories, while Ayanna and Tayanita planned the spring planting with several white and native farmers who had joined their cooperative. "Uncle Samuel," Thomas said quietly, "do you think my father would be proud of what we've built here?" Samuel looked at his nephew. This boy who had arrived as a starving orphan and had become the heart of a community, and felt Emma's presence in the room as surely as if she was sitting beside them. "Son, I think your father would be amazed," Samuel replied. "Not just proud, but amazed. We've done something here that most people would have said was impossible." As if summoned by their conversation, Winona approached them, carrying a small, wrapped gift. "In our tradition," she said, "we mark the winter solstice by giving something that represents the light that will return with spring." She handed Thomas a small leather pouch containing seeds, corn, beans, and squash, along with a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a growing plant. "These are for you to plant in the spring," she explained. "But more importantly, they're a promise. No matter what challenges come, no matter how harsh the desert seems, there will always be another season for growing." Thomas accepted the gift with reverence, understanding that he was receiving more than seeds. He was being given a place in the continuing story of this land and these people. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the New Mexico territory, covering the harsh desert in a temporary blanket of softness. But inside Samuel's farmhouse, now the heart of an unlikely community, the warmth came not from the fireplace alone, but from the knowledge that they had proved something important about human resilience and the power of people to create family from the raw materials of need and hope. The legend of the warrior sisters had indeed been proven wrong. Orphan boys could not only survive an encounter with these formidable women, they could thrive and help others thrive as well. But more importantly, the legend had been replaced by something better. A story about how broken people can become whole by choosing to be family to each other, even when everything in their history says such choices are impossible. As Thomas drifted off to sleep that Christmas Eve, surrounded by the quiet conversations of people planning a shared future, he carried with him the profound understanding that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with leaving home, but with finally learning what home means. The desert had not grown less harsh, the challenges had not disappeared, and the future remained uncertain. But in this small corner of the American frontier, different kinds of people had discovered that survival could become something more powerful when transformed into a commitment to help each other flourish. And in the spring, when Thomas planted those precious seeds in the carefully prepared soil, they would grow into something that fed not just bodies, but the continuing dream of what America could become when its people chose cooperation over conquest, understanding over fear, and family over the artificial boundaries that too often keep human hearts apart.